Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Richmond Jr., and today I'm welcoming Spencer LaJoye. Spencer is a folk pop singer-songwriter, violinist, and vocal loop artist in Boston, Massachusetts, who believes everyone is made of the good stuff. A 2021 Caryville New Folk Songwriting Competition winner, LaJoye makes music to tell the truth and return to their body as a queer person in recovery from American Christian evangelicalism. Delivering Broadway-esque melodies accompanied by a weathered dreadnought, their performances are equal parts confident quirk and elegant storytelling. You can find out more about Spencer at spencerlajoye.com or on Patreon, also at Spencer LaJoye. All right, welcome to the show, Spencer LaJoye. Thanks for being here. What else would you like our audience to know about you?
Oh gosh, you got most of it in the bio, but yeah, I'm a musician living in Boston right now with my wife, and I'm psyched to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, I have to ask you this again off the cuff, and this is something I always ask anyone who lives in the Massachusetts area. This may mean nothing to you, so forgive me. Mm-hmm. Are you a Red Sox fan?
Listen, me and sports, I love watching people be passionate about something. So if I engage in a sporting event, it's usually me watching other people, be really stoked about it. So the answer to your question is no, but I love people who love the Red Sox. Okay.
I can live with that.
What about you?
I'm a Yankees fan, so that's why I ask. Would have to have immediately ended the interview right there.
I think I have a Red Sox hat. I have like the Boston, because we've got them when we moved to Boston to fit in.
Yeah. Well, regardless, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Share, if you would, kind of about your faith journey, what that's looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Yeah. So I grew up in a big old family, and my dad was Catholic and my mom was Presbyterian. So I was Presbatholic is what I like to say. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of beautiful. The whole family would go to the Catholic church on one Sunday, and then the very next Sunday we'd go to the Presbyterian church, and it would sort of flip-flop back and forth. Both of my parents would go with us to each respective church. So it didn't feel like we were having to choose. So it was sort of ecumenical, my upbringing. And I think theologically that made me really, whole and healthy from a young age. Mm-hmm. I found evangelicalism, though, when I was in, middle school, high school, because I was this weird kid that was coming from a private Catholic school. Mm-hmm. And, I was bullied when I hit the public school system. And something that evangelicals do really well is they invite. And they, past that, whether they include all of you as a person is maybe another conversation. But as a young person who just needed a place to belong, there was this group of really kind young people who said, come sit with us at lunch, come to Bible study with us, come to youth group with us. Like, you are loved and you're part of this. And that was super appealing to me. So I bought and sold evangelicalism with a fire you could not believe. And that it kind of was like that through my young adulthood. I went to Calvin College, now Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I got a healthy dose of Calvinism there that I also bought and sold with fervor. Mm-hmm. So, the total depravity, all of that good stuff. But Calvinists also have a really robust view of creation, which was great for me as an artist and a young budding songwriter. Mm-hmm. So I found songwriting in my young adulthood there too. So that's sort of my past with Christianity. It was really, really important to me, and I was really obsessed with doing it right and being good and having the right theology and having proper exegesis. And toward the end of college, I came out first, obviously, to myself as bisexual at the time. And, my theology completely changed. I think the theological framework that I had previously had no room for me to be anything but cisgender and straight. It just had no room for that.
Right.
It wasn't even a possibility for me.
Yeah.
Because completely repressed. And so once I, came into myself and learned more about myself, I think I had to choose, right? I either get to hold on to that theology or I get to choose myself. There isn't room for both.
Yeah.
And I honestly don't like to think about what would have happened if I had chose what I thought was proper theology and orthodoxy and tradition. Yeah. If I had chosen that over myself, I don't like to think about what would have happened to me. But I chose myself. I'm really proud of that. And so I found progressive Christianity, and where I am now is less Christian than Christian. But that happened sort of organically and flowed out of that initial decision to choose myself and follow myself and listen to myself. And so I'm in this really sort of open and gracious place with myself and what I consider the divine. And did that answer your question? I got a little vague there at the end.
No, that's helpful. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate. I like hearing people's journeys and their stories. You mentioned off top you enjoy watching people be passionate. I enjoy hearing folks' stories. So appreciate you sharing that. Share, if you would, something like a spiritual practice, something that's meaningful for you, kind of keeps you grounded.
Yeah. I've recently discovered I'm on a journey of discovering how to get into my body. So my wife and I do like indoor rock climbing, bouldering mostly. And that has become a really spiritual practice, actually, at least very centering. I've always been active, but I find physical activity, very boring. With rock climbing and bouldering, it's much more like a puzzle, right? It's like Sudoku for the body. And I find myself very engaged, very present. So that's been good. Songwriting is my job, but the process of dropping down into my feelings and channeling honesty, that's part of the craft, and that part of the songwriting process of being completely honest with myself and the moment, that is a spiritual practice as well. Yeah.
Can I ask you a follow-up question there?
Please.
I imagine you have some familiarity from your background at Aleph. I'm intrigued when you say songwriting like is your job. Many pastors and clergy, church leaders would say something like similar, like writing sermons is my job, and it's easy for clergy, for pastors to get like, I don't know, stuck in the routine of it.
Yeah.
What is helpful for you to kind of, because you mentioned there's some real practicalness of like, hey, I got to write songs to bring in an income. I'm curious if there's any correlation or overlap that a clergy person might find helpful.
Yeah. And I've written sermons before too. I've done the preaching thing, and it feels very similar. So I feel like this is a great question. To be honest, I don't know. I'm currently discovering that the way I write music now or my process now is different than it has been in the past. And that scared me at first. I was like, am I becoming less of a songwriter? Am I losing the gift that I write my last great hit? Is have I peaked? Can I not do this anymore? And I'm just learning, no, my process is just different now. So before, for all of I think the greater part of the last decade, my process was sit down with regularity, do a free write or an object write, and every week make sure you churn out a song, right? I had a schedule. Just like every week I have to churn out a sermon, right? And sometimes those were great and sometimes they were mediocre, and that's just the way it is. And now I'm finding that I just need to keep the muscle worked. So every day I do a little bit of creative writing, whatever that looks like, even if it's 10 minutes, a little object writing exercise, keep the muscle active, and it's a spiritual muscle, right? That muscle of like being honest and descriptive and observing the world and interpreting it. That's the job, right? Before you put pen to paper, the job is existing and synthesizing information, in a meaningful way, making meaning. And that's the hard part. That's the muscle that gets really weak if I don't practice it. So now I'm noticing that just keeping that muscle active makes it a lot easier. Now I'm churning out like 2 or 3 songs a week because that muscle is staying really engaged.
Interesting.
Yeah. This didn't really answer your question. So I don't really have an answer, but I think for me right now, it's noticing the way that I'm drawn to songwrite and not forcing it so much like I used to, which was the right way for me to do it in the past. It just is not the right way for me to do it now.
Well, I think what you shared, for me at least, is helpful because I think back to my own quote unquote sermon writing career, how my process has changed. Other pastors who I've talked to, like the process changes. The pastor I work for right now has a quote unquote unorthodox method that clearly works for them.
What is that method? Can you share it?
Well, I don't want to throw them under the bus. Oh. It's very unorthodox.
Okay. Okay. You'll tell me off camera.
I'll tell you offline. Yes.
Offline.
Yes, I will. Well, since we're clearly getting into this conversation about music and church, let's just dive right in. I wanted to ask you, if I could, first off, in your bio, you describe yourself as someone in recovery from American evangelicalism. And obviously, I want to honor your boundaries here, what you are not willing to share. But I'm curious, can you share more about that and how that might be helpful for our listeners?
Yeah, that line in the bio, it's a little sound bitey, which I love. But I mean, it's a little, like clickbaity, but
right.
I do acknowledge that not all, Christian evangelicalism is the same. But what I came from was this, this emphasis on sort of proselytizing and spreading. Right. But there was also this emphasis on a personal relationship with Jesus, which is not inherently a bad thing at all.
Right.
But there was a lot of personal effort involved. And the brand of evangelicalism that it isn't even exclusive to a denomination. It was just sort of a muddled, because I have experience in a lot of mainline denominations, like Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Baptists. But within all of them, there's a really, there's this on fire for Jesus, born again, evangelical Christian.
Yep.
And those were my people. I unironically was in this traveling worship band in high school, and we called ourselves unironically Jesus Rocks.
Yeah.
That's what that's the brand. And I internalized this idea that to be a Christian, I had been prescribed transformation. And if I didn't see transformation in my life, if I didn't see some sort of deep change, if I didn't stop wanting people physically, right? Which was lust. As like a young person, right? Like, if I couldn't turn off my body, if I ever told a white lie, if I had a mean thought, everything was under scrutiny. And so I think in recovery from that, for me, it means that, well, inherently to say that I'm in recovery of it, what I'm saying, in recovery from it, what I'm saying is that it's still part of me a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a script. And that script, I know so well. I can recite it in my soul, in my sleep. So part of being in recovery from that is rewriting scripts, giving myself a new story, giving myself, or erasing the transformation prescriptions, right? And asking myself what it means to just be me. So I think that's what I mean when I say in recovery, is replacing some scripts or getting rid of the script altogether if it's not life-giving.
Yeah. That's really intriguing. You use a word, at least as I wrote it down, prescribed transformation. I've experienced in similar contexts, and I think that really resonates, at least with my recollection of that kind of culture, where it's like, in Denver, I don't know if you came across it during your time out here or your time in broader those kind of contexts. Like Acquire the Fire is like this kind of like big kind of like youth training conference event where it's just like get people riled up and go proselytize.
Youth training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just like this, again, this kind of like, if you're not 100%, it's either all or nothing. You got to be all in, on fire all the time. Right. And, that's exhausting, right? Isn't it?
Yeah. And burnout is inevitable. And to think that a young person would inevitably burn out and then feel so guilty.
Yeah.
Because now it's not letting themselves down, it's letting God down, right? Like, it's so...
Right.
Oh my gosh. That's a lot of pressure to be in love with a deity all the time. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's really interesting the way you say that. The pressure to be in love. I mean, I would use, again, in my language, I would say like, that's a lot of pressure to be in love with God all the time. Like, holy cow. Like, I don't know about you, but like, I'm not sure I'm necessarily in love with my spouse or my kids all the time, right?
Absolutely. Not like that.
If I can say that, hopefully without getting in too much trouble.
No. That makes a ton of sense. Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be healthy. I think that, and this is interesting, if we can follow this metaphor a little bit.
Yeah.
My wife and I have been married for just like 4 years, but I know that at the beginning of our relationship, it was this like very fiery, very attached.
Right.
I would say like codependent at first.
Yeah.
And with codependency, there's, insecurity on both sides, and you need the other person to need you.
Yeah.
But now it's less that. It's less I need this person to need me. And it's like, I need this person to be themselves, and I need room to be myself. And I think about a lot in my relationship with that God. When I was a young adult, it really felt like God was very insecure. Like God needed me to need him. Right. And if I didn't need him anymore,
right.
I mean, that's my fault. Right. And, I think that by the end of my time as a Christian identifying person, I just I had this God at that point that wasn't insecure, and this God didn't need me to believe in them. So it was this sort of gracious departure, right? It was I had this very expansive God who just didn't need me to need them anymore. So it's, for me now, it's less me saying that God doesn't exist or that God was never there. It's just me saying if that God is there, that God is expansive and gracious and loving and has no problem with me flourishing in myself away from them.
Yeah. I mean, I'll speak for myself here. You can respond. I'm thinking, to me, like, that sounds like a far healthier relationship than kind of what we talked about prior, where I think of like a healthy relationship is like where two people can be themselves without this kind of like, the codependency you were to use, like without being like, hey, I can't cease to, or I'll cease to function without you kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting, again, I'm thinking back how much you probably heard the same kind of lingo of like, God needs our worship. God needs our praise, especially around like the music in church. You've obviously spent a good bit of time, several years of higher education, studying God and theology. If I can ask you, like, have you found a way of talking about God? It sounds like you've hinted at this a little bit already, but I'm curious if you can flesh out a little bit more, a way of talking about God or the divine that really resonates with you.
Yeah. I think I don't have a problem with the words God and the divine. I think that the way that I think about God now is more of the attributes of God, right? So I'll say I believe in grace and I believe in compassion.
Yeah.
I believe in love and peace and joy. I believe in those things, and where they exist in the world, I have no problem saying that is divine.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, there's no answers to the questions. I like hearing perspectives here. Yeah. Perspectives here is what I get from it.
Yeah.
I mean, I often joke about this, that this is me now. I think I have like 20 years of like total educational experience, like from K through master's programs, right?
Right.
I've spent like 2 classes outside of a Christian educational institution.
Wow.
You did undergrad, right, at a Christian-based institution. If I understand correctly, you went to ILF, which is again a theological post-grad place.
Yeah.
I mean, what are your thoughts on, like, I'm not sure even how to ask the question, but like, do you think we just overcomplicate things? I'm thinking as a big, huge, universal we of perhaps Christianity historically. Are we overcomplicating things when it comes to talking about God, the divine, having a relationship with us?
I mean, I think we overcomplicate so much theologically. It's so interesting to think about. At one point, it was very important to me to get like down and dirty in theology, to just like really pick it apart and decide what I believe.
Yeah.
And back it up with scripture, right? And like, I guess the apologetics of it all, but not even just apologetics. Like in grad school, when I was already like an out queer person, which is how I identify, and progressive, quote unquote progressive, it was still, I think, for a large part of grad school, it's really important for me to get into the details of theology and sort of systematize it. But now, it's been like this for a while, I just think it's all a little complicated. And I love the Lutherans because they're very forward about the fact that, their hermeneutic, they say, the Bible, scripture, it's just a cradle that holds Christ. Our hermeneutic is Jesus. Yeah. That's it. And I'm like, thank you for being honest about that lens. And so for me now, my whole theological framework comes down to my theological anthropology, which is the fact that I think everybody is made of the good stuff. Everybody's just essentially good.
Yeah.
They're just essentially okay. And systemic sin, all of that, whatever, it muddies things up. We really F up. That's not to say our behavior is good, and that's not to say we don't need grace and forgiveness, because we do.
Right.
But I think that at our core, we are made the same, and it's good. And if we can just get back to that somehow, and that's going to take a lot of like reparations and reconciliation, et cetera, et cetera. And that's pretty simple to me. I don't need all the exegesis anymore, and it kind of exhausts me to go there.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? Do you?
Yeah. Because I've often found myself in I think a similar position. Like I've recently joked, like this is like I'm currently working for UMC Church. It's like the 5th Christian tradition I've worked in. Someone's asking me like, "Hey, as long as you believe the Apostles' Creed, you're cool with me." I'm like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." So it's I don't want to like diminish like particularities like. Obviously colleagues now in the UMC, they have some things that they hold seriously. Other traditions I worked in, they hold those things seriously. I respect those, but I'm also like, I want to love God. I want to love others. It's interesting.
Yeah. I love particularities, right? Absolutely. And as far as for me, when you ask for overcomplicating things, I immediately think of like that LGBTQ plus inclusion debate. And I think about the people who have come to be inclusive and affirming because they have weeded through the clobber passages and have decided that Scripture has given them a permission to love people. And for me, that's an overcomplication. For me, I'm like, why do you need Scripture's permission to love people?
Yeah.
You can probably find whatever you want. You can find an excuse for any kind of behavior in Scripture if you're looking for it.
Yep.
If you're starting with, I want to love these people,
yeah,
you can find it.
Yeah.
So just start with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So I'm going to kind of make a shift here. Yeah. Spencer is also an incredibly talented musician and has done a lot of work, at least as I see it, in the church around music. And I'm curious, I would at least interpret music as a passion of yours. I'm assuming that's true.
Yeah.
How can music in the church be used for good? And then I'm kind of curious if you can share like when it's not used for good, if that's a fair question.
Music has never, or I'll say it this way. When I think about my time in the church seriously, and the things that were good and the things that were bad, I will say music was never something that gave me trauma.
Okay.
I would say that the music always enhanced whatever theological culture was already present.
Interesting.
And I think something that frustrates me about the state of progressive churches and what they're trying to do with music. I think they spend a lot of energy on tweaking old hymns, changing the words, which isn't a bad inclination to make them more inclusive, to make them anti-racist, right? Great. But I would say music is there to enhance and uphold whatever theological culture is present. So if the church isn't actively trying to be anti-racist and queer affirming and earth loving, if they're not if they're not already cultivating that culture, it doesn't matter what that those tweaks in the music will be empty.
Right.
So I love music. I think for me, it's my job. It's my passion. It's the most important thing in the world. And it is a product, music is a product of the environment in which it's created. So I think if you're, hiring or finding musicians to write and create music for your church, it's more about culture making than it is about just making sure that your music has good theology.
So I want to preface this by saying, like, I'm not a musician, appreciate music, but like, it's not, I've tried to pick up guitar here and there. It's just not my thing. Mm-hmm. So this may be hopefully not too of an unintelligent question, but I'm curious, like, I think at least from my perspective, I think what commonly gets discussed around music in church is like the styles thing, like, I'm guessing you're probably old enough to perhaps remember the kind of the worship wars that happened in like
organ versus drum set,
right? Yeah. And like I had one colleague I used to work with who came from like evangelical spaces to my denomination. I'm ordained in the Disciples of Christ, and was like, "Oh, I can't believe y'all are still having the worship wars like 20, 30 years later." Kind of these continuing conversations about like what style the music is most appropriate in church, or what style most resonates with people. If I'm curious, like, if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like you're saying like style. It's not so much about what style is best. It sounds like what you're saying. So am I hearing you right? Kind of, you're saying like what fits with what your culture and theological values are?
Yeah, I think the worship wars discussion is a distraction. I think it's not the main point. I'm willing for people to push back and argue there. But, an organ isn't traumatizing. A drum set isn't traumatizing. An electric guitar, a choir, these things, there is nothing inherently beautiful or ugly about them, or jarring even. It's whatever theology is tied up in there. So if you have somebody who has trauma from a church that sang a lot of hymns with an organ, that trauma comes from the bad theology that the church professed, right? It doesn't come from the organ.
Yeah.
So I think it's a distraction, honestly. I think it's a distraction.
So again, if I'm hearing you right, I think we could summarize, if I'm hearing right, saying something like, whether you're going to use organ music or piano hymns or a modern quote unquote worship band, like, it's more about the theology behind the music than the style of music itself.
Yeah. And, people love music. Music is the thing that makes them feel something in a service, right? So I get that we think that that's the main point.
Yeah.
But the music actually isn't the main point. And I'm saying this as a musician, and I love music.
Yeah.
The music is not the main point. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
What would you say is the main point then?
I think that's for the church to decide, right? Like, what is their thing? What are you trying to say? Are you trying to be an inclusive congregation? Then include people.
Yeah.
And the music should follow suit.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
What am I trying to say here? I've observed that I think in many evangelical church spaces, like, predominantly speaking, like, evangelicals wouldn't believe in like sacraments, right? Since most evangelicals are kind of Baptist light, they'd be like, we have two ordinances, baptism and communion, right?
Yep.
So I don't spend a ton of time in evangelical Sunday morning spaces, but when I have, it's like, to me, it felt like they didn't even like know what to do with like baptism and communion when they're taking place in the worship service. And I observed that it almost seemed like the two sacraments, again, they wouldn't use these words, my words, are like the worship music and the sermon, the message.
Absolutely.
So again, I kind of think about like your thing about what's the main point and how are you structuring what you're doing and what's the main point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think of Hillsong, right?
Yeah.
And just because, I mean, that's just such an archetype. It's so easy to.
Right.
And maybe they would say that musical worship is the main point, which is very telling because the theology of those songs is so anemic.
Mm-hmm.
It's very telling. That's all I have to say about that, right? I mean, and whatever words are said in the sermon, I think that's, and I mean, honestly, I think that in spaces like Hillsong and evangelical spaces like that, it's very cerebral. Evangelicalism is very cerebral. It's very, enlightenment, believe, ascend to these beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's the point. And I think that for churches or denominations, traditions with a more robust, sacramental practice, that's much less cerebral and much more bodily. And I think that their quote unquote main point would be a lot different than an ascension to a set of beliefs.
Yeah, this is good. So if I'm hearing you right, then I always like to get practical at the end. If I'm hearing you right, I'm guessing you would say something like, before you're having a conversation about songs or style worship, you'd be like, what's your main point you're trying to do? Yes?
Yeah. And everything should work together for that main thing. In songwriting, we call that prosody, right? Mm-hmm. The words and the lyrics and the chords, everything should be working together to communicate the thing that you're trying to say. And that works, I think, when you're putting together a ritual, a church service.
Can you?
And I would say, yeah, go ahead.
Spell that word for me, prosody?
Yeah, prosody.
I mean, I already had to look up anemia, and I didn't want to admit that.
Oh, yeah.
Can you give me an example? Like, I'm curious to hear more what that looks like in practicality.
Oh yeah, so like in songwriting, and you can mess with it too. Like you can make it go. You can break the rules to make a point too. But so if I'm singing about being very, very simply, if I'm singing about being happy, I'm going to want it to be upbeat. I'm going to want to use these specific chords. I'm going to want it to land on the tonic. These things that feel good and comfortable and at home. If I'm trying to sing about something that is a little tense, I might mess with my syllabic stress in my lyrics. I might make it feel a little awkward. I might use some like dissonant chords. So that's right. So all of the parts, the lyrics, the tempo, the chord structure, the melody, all of it is working together to communicate the thing.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's helpful.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a bunch more questions, but for sake of time, I won't on that.
Okay.
Let me ask maybe 1-2 questions here before we take a break.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to churches who are like, hey, we want to become more inclusive. We want to become more welcoming. If I'm hearing you right, it sounds like you're against kind of the 3-step solution and encouraging folks to do some real work. But let me let you talk about that, not me.
Yeah. Gosh, I would say try to stop being an inclusive church and just include people. And I guess I would ask, do you even know who's in your, pews, for lack of a better word? Who's in your seats right now? Are all of them included? Is all of them included? I think a big banner statement that inclusive churches like to put out there is, all are welcome. And I always like to ask, do you mean every single person is welcome or every single part of you is welcome?
Mm-hmm.
Because if there are people still in your pews and you don't even know that they're grieving about that thing, or they can't bring into the service that they are polyamorous, they can't bring it. There's no room for it there. There's no room for their queerness. There's no room for their culture. I think it's really easy for churches to focus on the people that aren't in the seats and say, how do we welcome them?
Yeah.
How do we welcome the newcomer? And I'm just like, is every part of the people who are already there, are they welcome? Or do you have members of your congregation who can't bring a part of themselves in? And how do you make sure that they feel like they can stay, like they don't have to go? That's
really good. That's really good. So I think that kind of like, I can't think of what the word would be, but it's like that's kind of like we're kind of like project out there, like, oh, we're going to become welcoming to those out there.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good observation. Okay, one more final practical question. Like, if you could change anything about church music, and I guess this is kind of me asking the question twice because I'm asking the Pope question here coming up. So maybe don't give me your full answer, but if there's something, maybe simply let me ask you this, like instead, like something obvious you could fix about church music, what would it be?
Something obvious. I think there needs to be new music, and that's not a new thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is new music. I think that you just have to go find it. You have to dig a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Spencer LaJoye. Thank you so much for this time and conversation. Really appreciate your perspectives here. These closing questions, I always tell folks you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what might you want to do? What would that day look like for you?
If I were Pope for a day,
24 hours.
Oh gosh, I would say so many inflammatory things. I would say women have the right over their body. People with uteruses have the right to make choices over their own bodies, and God affirms that. I would say that, and I would also say queer people, you are affirmed in your consensual, compassionate concern. Any sort of mutually compassionate and consenting behavior, you are affirmed. I think that's what I would do. And I'd just throw a lot of like glitter and rainbows all over the Vatican. It'd be a mess. And that way they'd have to clean it up after the 24 hours were over.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. A theologian or historical Christian figure you want to meet or bring back to life?
Athanasius.
Oh, yeah.
I really like when he said that Jesus or God became man so that man could be divine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Oh, you had to have people on here who have said just the pandemic, obviously.
Yeah,
obviously.
Okay. Hopes for the future of Christianity.
I hope it. This is hard because I don't consider myself in it anymore.
Sure.
I hope that Christianity, if it ever fizzles out completely, I hope that people look back on it and say that it was about love. And if it doesn't fizzle, I hope it becomes about love.
It's pretty good. I'm also thinking more non-seriously about glitter is just a mess to clean up. So your legacy would just be there for some time.
I know. That's the point. Yeah,
it's good. Smart.
Make a mess. Thank you.
Share, if you would, where people can connect with you online, find your music, all that sort of thing.
Yeah. If you go to my website, spencerlajoye.com, all the links and everything should be there. Patreon is a way that I fund my career, and it's a really special place. So it's just patreon.com/SpencerLaJoye. or just follow me on social media. Instagram, I'm really active, Spencer LaJoye.
Awesome. Well, again, really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thank you, Lauren. Peace to you as well.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.